Hello everyone, welcome. I think we're potentially still waiting on a couple more people, but I can take my mask off. Welcome to our second talk of the day. Welcome everyone watching on our live stream. I'm sorry that you missed out on our lunch because it was amazing. The food here I cannot recommend enough. But yes, so our second talk today is from Alec Ryrie, who is a professor of history of Christianity at Durham University. He'll be speaking to us today from a recorded talk that he's already done, but afterwards we will be having a live Q&A on Zoom. So if anyone has any questions afterwards, I would very much encourage you to think of questions during the time we're watching the talk. If anyone has any questions afterwards, what you'll need to do is come up here and ask them kind of into the laptop and in front of people, if that's okay. I will now let us watch the talk. Enjoy.
So let me start by telling you how far out of my comfort zone I am today. I'm a church historian. My home patch is the Reformation age, the 16th to 17th centuries. My research right now is stretching into the 18th. That feels daring to me. But I do have some interests in the longer history of Christianity in Western culture. And although it's not really respectable for me as a historian to admit this, I've got a persistent interest in the present day as well, partly because I live here. And what I want to do today is to suggest a way of thinking about our own times, the age that we grew up in and have been living through, and the way that it's changing into something else before our eyes. We've lived in a firmly secular age in which religion, as it's been traditionally understood, is confined to certain well-delineated roles and has struggled to find a voice beyond them. But that age, I'm going to be arguing, is based on a set of shared cultural assumptions and values that are unraveling, and everything is now up in the air again. And I'll be suggesting what seems to me the essential way forward in this new world, a way forward which, as my title suggests, is going to depend on people who are able to have one foot in religious tradition and the other in modern secular values. Okay, in 1947, the American radio network ABC began broadcasting a series with the modest title, The Greatest Story Ever Told. It ran for nearly 10 years. It was broadcast in over 50 countries. It spawned a novel and eventually an epic, star-studded movie. That teasing, irresistible title was an allusion to a poem called The Old, Old Story, written by an Englishwoman in 1866, which was set to music the following year and became a popular hymn. In neither case does the title feel the need to clarify what the story is, because everybody knows. The story of Jesus Christ was still, up to the mid-20th century, the defining story in British, American, Western culture more generally. A story told and retold, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so deeply familiar. Now, earnest Christian believers were, of course, a minority in both Europe and America in this period, but nominal adherents and assertive unbelievers also recognized the power of this story. Atheists and skeptics of this period, late 19th, early 20th century, generally went out of their way to praise Jesus as an exceptional moral teacher. Whether or not people believed he was God incarnate, Jesus Christ was that culture's most potent moral figure. The atheist use of Jesus as an exemplar should tell you that from the point of view of traditional Christianity, this centrality of Jesus is at least a little bit double-edged. It was almost routine for the figure of Jesus to be contrasted with the churches. The maneuver which Philip Pullman recently made in his novel, The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ, is a time-honored one. So, in one sense, Jesus as a stick could be used to hit the churches with. But even so, that meant that the critics of the churches were playing on enemy territory. After all, using Jesus to critique the churches is what Christian critics of various churches have been doing for centuries. Incidentally, I think this is why some campaigning atheists were and continue to be drawn to the historically bizarre claim that Jesus never existed. It is both a very implausible idea and logically completely unnecessary if all you're trying to do is mount a case for atheism. But if you're trying to find a way of negotiating this figure's moral authority, it's very attractive. One of the oddities then of public discourse about religion in the West in this period, sort of mid-19th to mid-20th centuries, is that both sides feel that they're losing. Christians during this period see themselves as being overwhelmed by rising secularism, but the anti-religious and the secularists also see themselves as a tiny, embattled minority. And I think this is because while Christian practice is becoming a minority pursuit in this period, Christianity continues to frame public discourse and values. And in particular, it defined shared ethics. Providing a universal moral framework is almost its core purpose. It continues to do that for believers and unbelievers alike. That's why you retold the old story. That's why you told it to your children, even if you no longer believed it as doctrine or as history. You still believed it as value. So making a film out of the greatest story ever told must have seemed like a pretty good bet. But by the time it's finally released in 1965, it's no longer quite so straightforward. The global box office takings, $15 million, only cover 3/4 of the film's huge production costs. It's critically panned, partly because it's got a 4-hour running time. And it is now best remembered for John Wayne's unintentionally comic cameo as the centurion at Calvary. Reverence was no longer the order of the day. This is a microcosm of the seismic cultural change of the 1960s. Talking to an SCM meeting about the 1960s seems almost crass because the British SCM experienced the 60s spiritual whiplash in as extreme a form as almost any other group on the planet. What had been a large mainstream Christian movement in the 40s and 50s underwent a near-death experience in the 60s and early 70s, collapsing to less than a tenth of its previous numbers, as it wrestled with how to stay true to the values of the age and in the process lost hold of, or indeed deliberately renounced, much of its traditional Christian identity. And so the SCM in the 60s ended up as neither one thing nor the other, a Christian group that was too politically radical for most Christians and was too Christian for most political radicals. But I think this is actually a kind of accelerated microcosm of the whole story of modern secularism. So what brought Western societies to this tipping point in the 60s? This point when European and North American society began seeing itself as pluralist rather than as Christian, when religion retreated from the public square at a new pace. Well, it's worth noticing what didn't cause this decisive shift towards the secular. Christianity was not suppressed, or persecuted. There have been plenty of attempts to confront Christianity directly in European and North American history, from the French Revolution and communist groups through to smaller scale campaigns by local atheist pressure groups. None of these have proven very successful. If anything, the period in the West since the 60s is distinguished by the lack of substantial, coordinated anti-religious campaigns. Nor does this secular turn reflect any kind of contemporaneous collapse in the intellectual case for Christianity. Most modern atheists are happy to present themselves as heirs to the Enlightenment critique of religion or of the 19th century's debates about science. There's not much about this case that's really new. Maybe a psychological, neurological dimension. If anything, the classic materialist arguments against Christianity have weakened over the past century. A century ago, an educated layperson in Europe or North America might have been expected to believe that the universe is infinitely old and entirely deterministic. They might have believed that humanity's so-called races are fundamentally different from one another and don't share a recent common ancestor. They could have believed that the process of evolution is governed by some sort of progressive life force, that the New Testament is a collection of myths created some centuries after the events it claims to describe, and that the Old Testament is a mere collage of stories shared by peoples across the ancient Near East. All of those beliefs were the conventional wisdom of educated people at the beginning of the 20th century. All of them are, of course, inimical to traditional Christianity, and none of them stood the test of time. My point being simply that if Christianity has disintegrated intellectually, it didn't happen in the 1960s, it happened a long time before. So what did happen in the 60s? Well, I want to suggest that Western Christianity didn't face a political or an intellectual crisis, it faced a moral crisis. The moral authority of Christianity was already crumbling in the interwar period, but then comes the most decisive moral event of the modern age, the Second World War, the most terrible conflict in human history. This, by the way, is one of the very few photographs that we've got of the liberation of Auschwitz. The Allies, especially America, portrayed the war as a struggle for Christian civilization or Judeo-Christian civilization against an unspeakable and anti-Christian evil. And that wasn't exactly wrong, but it was a bit of a stretch, not least when so much of the fighting and dying was being done by the assertively atheist Soviet Union. Christianity's moral authority was in fact fatally weakened by the Second World War. Not only because many churches and Christians were to a degree complicit with Nazism or fascism, or at least fatally indulgent towards them, but in the wider sense, the global crisis underlined that Christianity's moral priorities were wrong. It now seemed plain that cruelty, discrimination, and murder were evil in a way that, say, fornication, blasphemy, and impiety were not. The struggle against a totalitarian regime that defined itself by racism and by dehumanizing its victims, that's what provides the moral template for the post-war age, a template that felt more powerful than the Christians and their old story. And as the post-war generations digest these lessons, they turn the war into the Western world's foundation. You'll sometimes find cultural conservatives worrying that modern Western societies lack shared sacred narratives. I don't think that's true. In the same way that Victorian publishers endlessly retold the life of Jesus, post-war films and novels and other media endlessly retold and keep retelling the Second World War. We are still at it. It is the story that we keep returning to. Have you ever heard any one snatch of audio repeated as often as Chamberlain's broadcast of the 3rd of September 1939, informing the nation that we're at war? And yet, though repetition ought to have dulled it, though I was born more than 30 years after Chamberlain died, it still turns my spine to water every time I hear it. My children, who were born in a different millennium, watched the newest cinematic retellings of the war's story, transfixed, and they are hungry for more. The phrases of Churchill's speeches have sunk into our memories and grip us like words of scripture. You may have heard of Godwin's law. This is the principle that every argument on the internet eventually ends when someone calls someone else a Nazi. It's not an accident. It's because in our culture, that is the ultimate insult. And the reason that it ends an argument is that it's a slap in the face. There's nowhere to go from there. What can you say? The struggle against Nazism is our final reference point. The Second World War retains an unparalleled grip on our imagination because it's our paradise lost. It's our Trojan War. It is our age's defining struggle. Our modern creed was summed up by that great philosopher, Indiana Jones. Nazis, I hate these guys. A century ago, the most potent moral figure in Western society was Jesus. Now, it is Adolf Hitler. Maybe we still believe that Jesus is good, but not with the same fervor and conviction that we believe Nazism is evil. Crosses, crucifixes have lost most of their power in our wider culture. You can play with them, you can joke about them, nobody really minds. There is no visual image that now packs as visceral an emotional punch as the swastika. The contrarians, the trolls, the shock merchants of our day and age generally understood that this is a line that they don't cross. Ken Livingstone's long career of rule breaking may have convinced him that there was nothing he could say that would go too far. But it turned out that there was one thing. To put it another way, if you defend Stalin, or if you peddle conspiracy theories about 9/11, you're going to be seen as deluded. But if you deny the Holocaust, then you are an intolerable monster. And when you're ostracized for that, nobody's going to leap to your defense and talk about cancel culture. And rightly so, because we know that in our cultural context, Holocaust denial is never a naive historical mistake. It is always a deliberate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. It is our modern equivalent of blasphemy. They are words that deny the deepest moral truth that our society is built on and which we know are never spoken in innocence. In other words, the reason our society collectively relinquished its grip on Christianity in the 60s and since is that we don't need it anymore. Its one function had been to provide a moral compass, and now we've got a new one. If you read accounts of people who have turned from Christianity to some form of materialism or humanism in the West in the last generation or so, a recurrent point is that they came to feel either that their Christian morals were in conflict with their post-Second World War moral convictions, often over some specific issue like sexual ethics or control over their own bodies, or that they came to feel that their moral convictions could stand by themselves and that their Christian beliefs were simply redundant and could fall off and wither away. If there's a central idea to this new ethic, it is the idea of human rights. That's the foundation of our post-Second World War ethic. very deliberately formulated by legal philosophers to counteract an alternative idea which is popular in the wake of the First World War, that is the idea of group rights, the idea which underpins principles like national self-determination and ultimately the rise of militaristic exclusionary nationalism. It's explicitly in response to Nazism that we have the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950. This is foreshadowed in the Atlantic Charter of 1941. But of course, the notion of human rights goes back. Before that, the American Constitution had a Bill of Rights, so-called, attached to it. That title is lifted from an English document that's a century older. Those are legal rights asserted against specific authorities. But the French Revolution of 1789 produces a declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. And that too is informed by an earlier text, the work of the Francophile philosopher and slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's another of our moralizing skeptics. He's a deist who explicitly opposes the moral teachings of Jesus to the corrupt doctrines of Christianity. And this is what he famously wrote in the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So notice that Jefferson doesn't make an argument for the existence of human rights, men's rights. Nor does he attempt to enumerate them exhaustively the way his successors would. He just insists that they are self-evident. They are obvious. Not coincidentally, this is exactly the way that generations of clergymen claimed that we know that there's a God. Subsequent declarations of rights have done essentially the same thing. The French Declaration simply says that the rights it describes are the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man. How do we know that human beings have rights? We just know. Now, this is obviously problematic. On one level, Jefferson's claim is simply untrue. The existence of human rights is not self-evident. That is to say, a great many people in a great many historical settings have not believed that any such rights exist. The people whom Jefferson kept as slaves might have had something to say about this as well. But that's kind of a banal point. I think we all know that the modern doctrine of human rights is a castle in the air. It's a defiant, existential assertion of values without any firm foundation. If we're philosophers, that might bother us. But this is what I think is important. Most of us, most of the time, are not really bothered about this. Because on a deeper level, for us at least, Jefferson is right. We really do find the existence of human rights and human equality self-evident. The intellectual basis for that doctrine may be weak. We may know that as a matter of fact they're not, but it feels intuitively true. And if we try to articulate why that should be, why we believe we have this right, and the very effort to do that feels uncomfortable, as if we're questioning something that ought not to be questioned, committing a kind of blasphemy. If we try to articulate the kind of argument we come to is the one advanced by the UN Declaration in 1948. That begins by asserting that human rights are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's a little bit more pragmatic than the one to claim Jefferson. And it then goes on to explain that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. And in the advent of a world which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So this is all about the Second World War. Of course it is. It's 1948. What do you expect? It is the experience of exceptionally barbarous acts and the claim that common people have united around a declaration of 4 basic rights, which underpins the entire structure. Those 4 rights being the 4 rights of Churchill and Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter. The assumption that the common people are identical to the victorious allies is reflected in the way that the phrase the United Nations slides from being a term for the military alliance against the Axis powers to being a name for the post-war international organization which the victorious allies founded. Now, to begin with, in the 1950s, the war was mostly remembered in nationalistic and heroic terms. But as the post-war generations began to grow up, as it became possible to look directly at the deeper wounds that the war had inflicted, the mood begins to shift. Not just because of events like the Eichmann trial in 1961, the Spiegel affair in West Germany in 1962, things which actively force a reckoning with the memory of the war. You also have things like the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in 1960 and the contemporaneous civil rights movement in the United States, which show that evils which at least resonated with Nazi racial ideology are still destroying lives a decade and a half after Hitler's suicide. So the war had been won, but it wasn't over. And the real proof of the power of this story, of how central it's become to our sense of ourselves, is how we've turned it from history into meaning, how we've transposed it into timelessness. It started while the war was still going on. To many people, it is incongruous or even embarrassing that the 20th century's best-selling work of fiction is an excessively long, unapologetically archaic, and sometimes self-indulgent fairy tale written by a philologist who was a very traditional Roman Catholic and whose most devoted readers were and remain teenage boys. But even if you share the, I think now receding disdain for Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, there is no gainsaying its cultural importance. Tolkien himself had no patience for allegory as a literary form. He vigorously denied that he'd written one. But if his War of the Ring doesn't mirror the Second World War, which was raging as he wrote the book, it certainly refracts it. And he privately admitted as much. Tolkien is an early and a staunch opponent of Nazism, but he was also a veteran of the Battle of the Somme. And he knew that this war was, like any war, an ultimately evil job. That's what he wrote to his son when the son was on active service in 1944. And Tolkien used the language of his own developing myth to explain what he meant. Not only, as he said, that there are a great many orcs on our side, but that we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. Such a war might end in victory, but the victory's only effect would be to breed new Saurons. Only Tolkien's mythical version of the war could be won with moral purity. But if we're using the war's memory to set our moral compasses, then mythical, clear-cut versions of it are exactly what we need. That's what Tolkien gave us, and as he predicted, we have been breeding new Saurons ever since. The figure of the Dark Lord has stalked through the most persistent and popular mythologies of the post-war period, from Star Wars' Darth Vader to Harry Potter's Voldemort. The debt that these ersatz Hitlers owe to their real-life archetype is sometimes implied, sometimes open, but it's always plain. These are the myths on which generations of children in the post-Christian West have been raised, transposing, cleansing the brutal lessons of the Second World War into timeless morality tales. This is a lesson that our culture seems determined to teach itself and eager repeatedly to relearn. This is what true evil looks like, even though In reality, evil rarely appears in such unambiguous dress. This transposition into myth has all kinds of advantages. It allows the myth to evolve, to purify itself, even to eat itself. You can condemn Churchill's imperialism. You can condemn the queasy racial politics of Tolkien's world. Even J.K. Rowling's alleged transphobia, even as you take your bearings from the moral universes that they've created for us. But self-cannibalism of this sort isn't usually a good sign. There are reasons to suspect that our post-war value system is running into problems. So that's how I think we got to where we are, with Christianity supplanted by a set of secular values that are much more experiential, intuitive, and mythic, and much less universal, rational, and indisputably self-evident than they claim. The fact that those values feel self-evident to us, as indeed they do to me, is not a solution. That is the problem. And the rest of what I want to say falls into the two halves promised by my title. First, why I think the values of this secular age, that value system that's more fragile than it feels, needs what Christianity can give it. And second, why Christianity needs those fragile values in return. Of course, just because I think something needs to happen doesn't mean it will. There are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic. But I do promise to offer you, in keeping with the theme of this conference, at least a sliver of hope before we finish. So why do I say this secular value system is running into trouble? Well, given how much it's based on a particular historical event, it's unsurprising that this event's grip on our imagination should falter as it falls off the edge of living memory. The stories do remain compelling, but they become unreal when we've no longer got parents or grandparents who can say to us, yes, I remember. Of course, Christians whose faith is based on a much further off historical event than that are well aware that pivotal events can become timeless, but the transition is a tricky one. And for all we remember it as the good war, the Second World War's morality is messier than we might like. Dresden, Hiroshima, Yalta, Churchill's pungent racial comments. And even if people like me, white middle-class Brits, are starting to see the story as a little less like a biblical cosmic moment and a little more like just another war, how much more so people whose background gives them a different perspective on a so-called world war fought between colonial powers. I think it's increasingly clear that one of the purposes which Britain's valorization of the Second World War has served is to act as a kind of historical virtue shield between ourselves and the uglier aspects of the British Empire. The gambit goes, yes, there were famines in India, but we stood alone against the Nazis, and so we come out ahead. In fact, all that maneuver seems to have done is to delay Britain's post-imperial moral reckoning, and that process is now plainly in full spate. In particular, it seems to me that over the past few years, the moral centrality of the Nazi era in this country's collective imagination is being seriously challenged by the slave trade. And it's the moral lessons, if it's the moral lessons that are learned from Nazism that are being used to critique the slave trade, well, that makes it so much more powerful. Not that I think the slave trade is about to become a unifying national myth. Rather, I think its new salience is indicative of a breakdown of that shared focus on a single key moral moment. Instead, people will gravitate towards the histories which teach them the moral lessons that they want to hear. There are also some conceptual problems. The most obvious is that by basing our value system around Hitler rather than Jesus, we've replaced a positive exemplar with a negative one. We know what to hate, but not what to love. Insofar as we do have shared positive values now, they are deliberately vacant categories like liberty, whose whose essence is that it's undefined. In the age of Hannah Arendt, our culture has developed quite a deep understanding of evil, although there are problems there too that I'm going to come back to, but an impoverished understanding of what philosophers call the good. Now, it would be normal here to start grouching about consumerism, but the desire for wealth and physical prosperity really is a more or less universal feature of human society. Those things have a perfectly legitimate place in the hierarchy of desires. The trouble is that in modernity, we lack much of a sense of anything to put on top of them. Apart from anything else, this lends itself to a wretchedly defensive public life in which the best we seem to be able to hope for is to resist various malign developments because we know what we hate, rather than to look for anything genuinely hopeful. In other words, we end up saying to each other that this world, as it is as good as it gets. And it turns out that for many of us, that's not quite good enough. And so our moral energies focus on opposition and denunciation. Our public discourse becomes increasingly shrill. One of George Orwell's less remembered but more queasily accurate prophecies in 1984 is the regular ritual of the 2-minute hate. Of course, he got the detail wrong. He meant to say the 140 character hate. As well as being tedious, it's self-cannibalizing. Haters, as they say, are going to hate. And since we're all haters now, we have to keep searching for new prey. The peculiar characteristic of this kind of hatred is the purity spiral, in which distinctions are drawn and virtue is signaled by turning on those who had previously been accepted or admired or neutral. And the incentive, of course, is to strike first before the same process is turned on you. Typically, this happens when a new orthodoxy suddenly hardens and then its application is declared retrospective. Trans issues have become the arena par excellence for this in the past few years, but there are others, and we've seen it happen before. One phrase which I keep being struck by in the arguments over these issues is the phrase, "My human rights are not up for debate," or variants of this, which you'll often find used by LGBTQ advocates, but certainly not exclusively. I think it's a really interesting turn of phrase. It wants to be read, I think, at 3 different levels. And the first one, it's self-evidently true, and the second, it's self-evidently false, and in the third, it's, I think, true in a deeper sense. So at the first level, it's obviously correct in that it is insulting or worse for some people, typically straight, white, middle-class, cisgender men, to debate whether people who are different from themselves share in their own rights and to expect those different people to participate. To do that is to sit in a place of security, asking other people to discuss dispassionately whether they deserve to be allowed to live. But the same gambit, "my human rights aren't up for debate," is also obviously wrong, because plainly all of our human rights are and must be up for debate. We disagree with one another about what human rights are. The various declarations and bills of rights vary considerably. Even if we can agree on the basic list, rights conflict with each other, and those conflicts have to be resolved. There's a reason that human rights law is a complex and contested field. Human rights must be debated, because the only alternative to debating them is fighting about them, or allowing one person's view to ride roughshod over everybody else's. But on a deeper level still, the claim that human rights aren't up for debate takes us back to Jefferson's claim that human rights are self-evident. On the most fundamental level, the subject can't be debated, because there's no basis on which to do so. Rights are asserted, and you either accept the assertion or you don't. Actual debate, constructive, good faith discussion between people of different viewpoints who are honestly pursuing agreement, that is formidably difficult in this area. It's increasingly hard to find shared ground on which such a debate can be held. And therefore, debate swiftly turns into mutual mockery or even willful or malicious misunderstanding. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. I imagine many of us have found ourselves caught in conversations of that kind. It's simply inevitable. That is where our increasingly brittle systems of value are taking us. You'll notice that part of the brittleness of this system, one of the problems built into a value system defined by evil rather than goodness, is its lack of space for forgiveness and for redemption. Indeed, those concepts are often seen as suspects, and fair enough. They are often tools used by the powerful to create impunity, demanding forgiveness from people who instead deserve to be given justice. Christians have, of course, been deeply implicated in this abuse of the notion of forgiveness, and we should not accept absolution for that sin too quickly or easily. And yet the problem remains. The moral lessons we've learned from the Nazi era do not have much to say about forgiveness. The great political lesson learned from the Second World War is about the folly of appeasement. That is the lesson that leads directly to the Suez fiasco in 1956, which leaves Kennedy with terrifyingly little room for maneuver during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and is implicated in many of our more recent wars as well. It is a principle that says that you forgive nothing. In law, we find it increasingly difficult to cope with amnesties or other acts of indulgence. The great modern exception to this rule, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is also openly influenced by Christian moral theology to an extent that's unusual in modern times. And I think that's why the many attempts to copy its formula in other contexts have generally failed. Ethics aside, I would suggest that merely as a matter of social and political pragmatism, some capacity for forgiveness is essential, especially in an age when the bottomless memory of social media means that forgetting, the traditional alternative to forgiving, is becoming increasingly difficult. Otherwise, we all end up spending our lives throwing stones at one another's glass houses. Or, more likely, the powerful end up manipulating this dynamic to give themselves new kinds of impunity, while wielding our unforgiving public morality to destroy whomsoever they choose. And even the central moral insight of our anti-Nazi value system is understanding of the power of human evil. Even that has its problems. You may remember the famous comedy sketch by Mitchell and Webb, in which they play two SS officers, one of whom begins to be troubled by the fact that he has skulls on his uniform, and eventually asks his comrade, "Do you think we might be the baddies?" The uncomfortable insight being, of course, that most Nazis didn't think of themselves as evil. Maybe none did. Real-life villains tend not to cackle diabolically. Our modern mythologized versions of the Nazis, our procession of dark lords, this is an almost farcically unrealistic depiction of what real evil looks like. Most villains don't wear skulls on their uniforms. They are slyer and subtler than that, and they're often rooted inside us. We can't defeat them by jumping into a Spitfire and blowing things up. And our anti-Nazi values don't give us much wisdom on how to tackle. You'll often see the term pure evil being wielded as an insult in our modern value system. Of course, in traditional Christian ethics, pure evil makes no sense. Evil is by definition impure. It's a negation, a corruption, a distortion of something that is or once was good. And that means it can be both forgiven and overcome. But it also recognizes its ubiquity and its many faces, like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families. The varieties of evil are endless. Yes, racism, militarism, patriarchy, authoritarianism, genocide, these things are evil, but they are not the only evil. Knowing that we're against them will not do us much help if we're trying to stop, say, a climate crisis or the entrenchment of economic inequality, or indeed a global pandemic. It was bleakly comic in 1920 to see how much the Western countries, none more than Britain, tried to understand the sudden crisis through the prism of the Second World War, frantically invoking the spirit of a blitz that only the very oldest of us can remember. But viruses are not Nazis. This is not an enemy whose morale we can break, or indeed it's trying to break ours. As the saying goes, we've been fighting the last war. We brought a Spitfire to a germ fight. And so a heroic national effort built Nightingale hospitals that it turned out we didn't quite need, and a new Dunkirk spirit signed up 500,000 volunteers that it turned out we couldn't really use. And meanwhile, none of our myths stopped us from emptying hospitals into care homes, killing tens of thousands with the speed that made the Nazi program to exterminate the chronically ill look amateurish. Nor did any of our myths stop London from enduring in April 2020 a month more deadly than any the Luftwaffe ever managed. In the last few months, our imaginations have latched gratefully onto the possibility that the pandemic started with a leak from a Chinese lab. That would mean a human villain behind it, of the kind that we understand. No, it isn't really to do with our Nazi obsession, the desire to find scapegoats for epidemics is an ancient one. But it still seems likelier that this was a natural event. And that underlines what may become the decisive weakness of our anti-Nazi value system, that it's got nothing directly to say to environmental issues. Indeed, by giving such a central place to human rights, it builds in an unhelpfully rigid distinction between the human and the non-human. It seems likely that the major collective challenges that we will face in this century will be triggered at least as much by environmental degradation as they are by genocidal tyrannies. We'd better have a value system that equips us to deal with both. So for all those reasons, I think that our current secular value system is breaking down, and that we're going to need to draw on the resources of our religious value systems, deep-rooted, ethically more supple and sophisticated, in order to replace or repair it. But there's another side to this question as well. Because as you will have noticed, the worldwide Christian response to the emerging crisis of confidence in our secular values has not, on the whole, been constructive or sympathetic. Instead, it's been characterized by smelling secularist blood in the water. Many of the most open political challengers to our post-Nazi ethical consensus, politicians like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or most notoriously Donald Trump in the United States. These men have characterized their brands of cultural conservatism as Christian, and they've won considerable support from evangelical constituencies in the process. At the risk of falling foul of Godwin's law myself, I do find myself reminded by these folks of the Nazi Party's claim in its founding program in 1920 that it stands for a positive Christianity. Not that these gentlemen are Nazis, obviously not, but they are making the same maneuver. They're using Christianity as an identity, a means of telegraphing their social and political position to potential supporters. For the Nazis, Christian was a code for anti-Jewish, anti-communist. Nowadays, it's a code for anti-Islamic, anti-academic, anti-globalist. In this usage, it's not really a value system at all. This is Christianity as a tribe, not as a movement. It may be loosely connected to the rejection of certain aspects of modern secular value systems, but most obviously to LGBTQ issues. But even this doesn't run very deep. I mean, these modern cultural Christian movements are, let's say, not marked by their ostentatious commitment to traditional Christian sexual ethics. Now, I need to be careful in how I comment on this phenomenon. And personally, I find most of the features of this assertive cultural Christianity pretty unpleasant. And indeed, since I also claim a Christian identity for myself, I find it embarrassing. I do want to try and put that to one side and examine it in a more hard-headed way. And I want to argue that for all the apparent surge of energy behind it in various parts of the world, this is a movement with no future. It is too plainly a reaction to, a mirror image of our modern secular values. Well, it certainly derives some of its power from the weaknesses of those values, their shallow roots, their brittle stridency. It doesn't solve those problems, quite the opposite. It provides our secular value systems with exactly the kinds of opponents that they crave. Be honest. When I said earlier that most real-world villains are subtler and more ambiguous than the caricature of the Dark Lord, did Mr. Trump cross your minds? He may have been Voldemort in a clown suit, but in a world where Voldemorts of any kind are pretty thin on the ground, you take what you can get. We may not know how to deal with climate change, with pandemics, with economic injustice, but at least we think we know how to deal with him. The gambit that these political movements are making is to attack our modern secular value system, the anti-Nazi system, but without putting anything in its place. The rhetoric is of a reversion to Christian values, to Christendom values, as we might say. But all that actually seems to mean is making some attempt to unlearn the moral lessons of the first half of the 20th century. In the short term, as we all know, the resulting vacuum of values simply fills itself with conspiracies and corruption. In the medium term, that really isn't going to be sustainable. It will fill itself with something else. Whether that something involves learning from the values of the secular world or embedding itself more firmly against them, that's going to be the decisive question. I think embedding against them would be wrong. But worse than that, I think it would be foolish. The moral lessons of the 20th century, the lessons that discrimination and cruelty and murder are worse than sexual or doctrinal errors. They were learned the hard way, very much like the great moral lessons of the 19th century, such as the lesson that slavery is wrong. A Christianity that has a future is one that embraces these values and doesn't do it grouchily or hesitantly, but wholeheartedly. And which, having done that, then asks what it can add to bring some color to a secular value system which only seems to be able to debate whether issues should be black and white or should be seen in shades of grey. A Christianity that has a future is one which provides something to love, in addition to all of the things that we know we have to hate. Can it be done? Well, I think so. I see considerable hope, I have to say, in Pentecostalism, or at least in Pentecostalism at its best, which offers genuinely uplifting and enriching spirituality, and which also reminds us that the political sphere, however important it is, will never provide us with salvation. We are at our most human, and we come closest in this world to finding whatever it is that we desire in community, in families. as individuals, not as mass collectives. If Pentecostalism isn't to your taste, well, fair enough. But a Christian movement that has for more than a century been led by and spread among the world's poorest and most persecuted people, and which now counts over 500 million followers, has, I think, earned the right to be heard. And anyway, whether or not the kind of synthesis I'm talking about can be done, it must be. We will not be able to manage the challenges of this century without the resources of our old values that tell us what's good, as well as our new ones that tell us what's evil. How can it be done? Well, the most obvious obstacle maybe contains within it the germ of a solution. Christianity has a very real problem of moral authority in our culture, for the excellent reason that it has been profoundly implicated in abusive and exploitative structures of power for centuries. It may simply be that we in our post-Christendom generation need to suck this up, to accept that Christianity is still a long way from having earned the right to be heard, that it needs to go deeper into the wilderness and spend longer there first, another century or two perhaps. Be that as it may, what's needed or what will be needed at the end of that is repentance, is humility, the very opposite of assertive claims to authority or moral denunciation. Repentance and humility are the only means by which Christians have in the past ever truly attained moral authority. And it also just so happens that those particular moral qualities, repentance and humility, are the ones which both our secular value system and its cultural Christian critics so obviously and so damagingly lack. Repentance and humility truly are something that a progressive Christianity, we could say an authentic Christianity, can bring to the table. Those of us for whom Jesus Christ is still the moral lodestar could do worse than go back to the first word that the first book of the New Testament records him as preaching. Repent.
It was really interesting. Yes, I'll take my mask off. Thank you. Sorry. Forget every time. I forget I'm wearing it and I forget not to wear it. But it's the life of Zoom, isn't it? I feel like we've all lived in the Zoom age. So I would like to invite any questions. Anyone at all? There is a tractor right outside. Patrick, come on up.
Right, so, yeah, my question is just, you talked a bit about kind of how our sort of moral sense to which comes from like being opposed to the Nazis essentially it defines much more what we hate rather than what we love. And you talked a bit about how the some of what we do say we value are kind of vacuous, I think you might have said, like the idea of liberty, but kind of what about all the other things which there are many sort of kind of positive rights, if you will, listed in human rights declarations and stuff like that, aren't there? I mean,
thank you. It's an important point. I hope I didn't say that I thought that liberty is vacuous. I do think that by its, liberty, I'm good with liberty, but I think by its nature it's an empty category, because it's open-ended. The question is liberty to do what, to be what. The way that we tend to describe freedom in modernity is about absence of constraint, absence of external constraint, and it gets tied up with notions like freedom of choice and election, which I think when you look at that in kind of longer philosophical perspective, I'm not a philosopher of any kind, so I'm sure many people here will be able to shoot me down on this. But my sense is that this is a pretty impoverished notion of freedom compared to some of the deeper traditions, which would see the most profound freedoms as the freedom to attain your own fullness, if you want to look at it in those sorts of eudaimonistic flourishing terms. But modernity is interested in this much more kind of practical, legal, and hugely important sense of freedom as absence of external constraint, which is great, but it's a first step. The question of what ought one to do with that freedom is one that we feel is a constraining question, and so have difficulty attempting to answer. So yeah, that's my sense is that that gives us a starting point, but no more.
Does anyone else have any questions? Naomi.
Hi Alec. I am Naomi, who emailed you. It's very nice to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Almost in real life.
Well, yes.
So I know that, Alec, you were an SCMer back in your own undergraduate days, and you have a room full of them here and some more on the live stream. I just wonder whether I can ask you to put your challenge to us that you've given us in your talk into some kind of SCM context. So is there anything in particular which you think I wish SCM members or SCM as a movement could do that would help to lead the church in better ways of being loving and repentant and humble?
Thank you, Naomi. That's a really good question. I don't have an easy or a simple answer to that, but I've got the best I can offer you is some hunches, and one of those is that I don't think it's an accident that the SCM was so much in the front line of some of the sets of crises cultural crises that I was talking about when they hit in the 60s, and that's because it sits at this intersection between the progressive church and the secular world, and that's a hugely important but not a comfortable place to be. It's a dangerous, a prophetic, a self-sacrificial place to be. But it really matters. Universities. Okay, I work in a university, so I'm going to think they're important. But SCM has got the S in the name. The the presence within the secular academy is where a lot of the ideas that I've been talking about have been formed and normalized and have spread out from there. The extent to which graduate, university education has become one of the kind of key cultural dividing lines in many Western societies, as you know, and that's an indication of the enduring significance of this cultural fight for the shaping of these values. So in that sense, I think the SCM is in the right place, because it's within that university context that a lot of these battles are going to be fought and won or lost. I suspect that the SCM may not be as well placed to engage with the wider church and with some of the problems of that kind of conservative cultural Christianity that I've talked about. There may be folks here who do feel able to get into that side of the struggle. Wonderful. But in terms of being able to find a voice to speak to that secular world in a way that enriches and works with it and adds to it rather than simply trying to confront it, I think the SCM may be, almost uniquely well placed to cross that bridge and find that kind of voice. At least, if the SCM can't, I don't know who can.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you, Alec. Does anyone else in the room have any questions? Yes? Yeah? I'm just checking the chat to see if we have any from the live stream. I don't believe we do. Tom, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Alec. So I guess we sort of started the story of your talk with society or a group of societies whose moral values were based on some form of Christianity, and then a period of those being displaced by the Second World War. What would you say are perhaps some of the differences between the Christianity and the moral kind of Christian foundations that we had with the ones that perhaps we should be aiming for, or the contributions that progressive Christianity can make in the future? Because I'm keen to I know it's not a kind of cycle that we want to go back to where we started. So what would the difference be?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really important, and I absolutely agree. I think that I was about to say that a cycle would be the worst outcome, maybe not the worst, but not ideal. And I think what it seems to me that what we need is a synthesis that draws on both elements of the older tradition and the newer one. As to what the values should of this synthesis should look like, I think we need to take the moral insights of modernity really seriously. The extent to which Christianity, by its interlacing with power of various kinds, had got itself stuck in obsessions with sets of values to do with essentially with controlling people's bodies, and also with policing their doctrines. The fundamental insights from modernity that I think that Christianity really needs to absorb is that those two things are not good. that there's no good Christian basis for doing them, and the fact that it took a secular movement to teach the Christian church that is a good ground for the kinds of humility and repentance that I've been talking about. Of course, some of the other insights that have come out of modernity about the sort of fundamental dignity of all human beings, of the irrelevance of ethnic or gender or other the other different ways that we tend to slice each other up, metaphorically and literally. That is a core Christian insight and value. I don't think we need to see that as something external that's being taken on. It's something that Christians have been banging on about, not quite as consistently as one might like, but even so for centuries. So to some extent, it's about relearning those sorts of values. But it's those two things about backing off from trying to control other people's bodies and other people's beliefs. That seems to me an important insight for us to hang on to.
Great, thank you. Do we have any more questions at all? Anyone else? Okay, no problem. Well, yeah, Alec, I just wanted to thank you again so much for your recorded talk today and for joining us for this Q&A session. We've had some really helpful insights.
Only sorry that I can't be with you in person, but yeah, well, 2021.
Exactly. We need no more words.
It's lovely to see that you do actually have an in-person gathering. It's a step forward to be talking to a group like this rather than for you all to be little squares on the screen.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite sunk in for us either that we're actually meeting in person, but it is just wonderful to be able to see people in real life. But yes, thank you so much. And have a great, yeah, we're going to have a cup of tea. I think we'll be back at the next workshop. Is that 4? Is at 4. You're welcome to join us in spirit.
This is the point where you.
Saturday.
This is the point where you traditionally say to a speaker, "Safe journey home."
Yeah, I mean, safe journey to the sofa.
How did you guess?
Well, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. I hope the rest of the conference goes well.
Great. Thanks very much, Alex.
Okay.